Good afternoon. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, August 25th, 2021. My name is Drew Clark. I'm the editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Very happy to welcome you to our event here today. This is going to be, I hope it will be a very exciting topic because we are speaking to some real experts in this subject matter. I'm not an expert in this subject matter of cybersecurity, but as someone who focuses and cares about our broadband infrastructure, you have to be concerned about cybersecurity. I mean, the extent and the level to which we've seen so much attention on this subject, whether that's actual real concerns and damage, we'll hear from our panelists. But there's certainly been a lot more coverage of cybersecurity and issues associated with cybersecurity. And while we will talk about the Biden administration's executive order that it issued on May 12th of this year during this discussion, we'll talk a little more broad than that about some of the issues associated with cybersecurity that we're seeing all over. Before I get into that, though, just let me take 2 or 3 minutes to step back and tell you a little bit about Broadband Breakfast, because there's a lot of things going on. We are a news source focusing on better broadband, better lives. That's our motto. We care about the infrastructure, and we also care about the applications and use of broadband and how it, how it impacts our daily lives, our use of social media, our use of how it impacts our privacy, and again, our security, right? That's increasingly part of the mix. And as I previewed, we're going to be talking with our experts about this just now in a few minutes. But before we get to them, I do want to give a shout out to our sponsors here at Broadband Breakfast. They include newly joining us is Powerhouse Management, Utopia Fiber, Lit Communities, Positron Access, Samsung, Broadband Now, and the California Emerging Technology Fund, another newly joined sponsor. We're grateful for all of them and for their making these discussions every Wednesday, 12 noon Eastern Time possible. And speaking of which, next week, we're going to be talking about the state of the broadband infrastructure legislation, right? I mean, we 2 weeks ago, the Senate passed this $1 trillion measure that includes $65 billion for broadband. We thought there was going to be, at first, some of us thought there was going to be some House action on that this week, but no, it turns out that it was kind of a little bit of a hide the ball, right? The House got another process, a budget resolution and a budget reconciliation process going. But what that means in the short run is we have to wait another month and change before this infrastructure legislation is even put before the House for a vote. And again, we'll be talking more about that next week during our session on September 1st. On September 8th, for those of you in Washington, D.C., we are very happy to welcome you back to in-person events. Broadband Breakfast Live Online will be joined together with our Broadband Breakfast Club, Broadband Breakfast for Lunch, we're calling it. And just to attend, you have to join to become a member of the Broadband Breakfast Club. We look forward to welcoming you, many more of you as part of the Broadband Breakfast Club and joining us in person for the event. The event will be a conversation with the CEO of Legato Networks and also the Competitive Carriers Association. We'll be talking more about that in coming weeks. That's 2 weeks from today on September 8th. I'll tell a little bit more about broadband communities and what's going on there at the end of the session, because I don't want to keep us too long from getting to our 4 panelists. And I'm going to go ahead and open the mic up, so to speak, to all 4 of them. We are, again, very excited for, and I'm going to mention them and introduce them in the order that they will speak here. We will start off with Christian Dawson, who's the co-founder and executive director of I2 Coalition Group. We'll look forward to hearing from him what I2 Coalition is and its priorities and some of their thoughts on cybersecurity. He will be followed by Joseph Bonneville, who is a non-resident senior fellow of the Geotech Center at the Atlantic Council. Joe is deeply enmeshed in this field and will offer some important thoughts on that. He'll be followed by Pablo Brainer. Thank you for joining us, Pablo. We didn't have a chance to say hello previously, but we'll hear from you for up to 5 minutes after that. Give us your perspectives on this topic. And then batting cleanup will be Scott McCulloch, who is of the McCulloch law firm and says he has contrarian views. We'll see. We'll see when we get to him whether they really are contrarian or not. But with that, let's go ahead and turn it over to Christian. Welcome. Thank you for being here with us. Tell us a little bit about yourself, I2 Coalition, and your take on cybersecurity.
Happy to, Drew. Thank you so much. And I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today. I'm a longtime follower of Broadband Breakfast. Drew, I've known you for a number of years, but I've never been a guest here. So I'm pleased to get the opportunity to do that.
Fix that error now. So
yeah, exactly. Part of that reason is, okay, so first I'll explain to you what the I2 Coalition is. I2 Coalition stands for Internet Infrastructure Coalition. And we're a coalition of companies in a traditional trade association stance of the companies that sit above the broadband layer, but below the content layer. So generally, we're not our members aren't made up of your direct constituencies, though we work tremendously closely with obviously the broadband community and all that we do. We're talking about cloud infrastructure providers. We're talking about data center providers. We're talking about domain registries and registrars, cloud web hosting providers, edge providers, internet exchange points, those types of companies. And our goal is to bring them all together with a singular voice on issues to allow companies to do more together than they can apart. Because you can affect more change and you can have a bigger voice, particularly on policy areas, if you can come together and all speak sort of with a single voice. And that's what we do. We try to make the internet a better, safer place by figuring out where we can exert points of influence on stuff that it is better to have a group of companies speak for. And I'm excited about being able to talk about the executive order, but more broadly about how we evolve requirements about cyber reporting in a way that doesn't kill innovation online. And I'll start by just saying, like, top line, one of the reasons that we started this organization is we realized that there were a lot of legislators that really didn't understand how the internet stuff works. It's really complex, and there's lots of different companies that do lots of different things. Legislators are out there trying to solve problems. And if you don't understand how this stuff works, you are very apt to try and come up with it's likely that you can come up with a really harmful or stupid way of approaching a problem. And so by being able to collaborate with a group like ours, we can sit there and say, okay, well, this is how this stuff works in the internet infrastructure and how you're not going to mess it up. One of the things that we have found is that in a light touch regulatory environment, which we've had for the 20 years leading up to the mass growth of the internet, that was an area where we could have lots of small companies coming out of their dorm rooms and starting in their basements or the middle of nowhere. And those are the ones that came out there and changed the world. And so when we go out there and advocate to legislators broadly about how they can approach regulation, we try to make sure that they understand that if they set the bar too high, they're going to kill innovation. And they're going to make it so that there's only going to be a few companies in this space, and that's not a recipe for very much innovation, which is something that I think the broadband community knows more honestly than the community of internet infrastructure providers that sit above it, where regulatory levels are higher. It's an environment that we don't want to get into. Okay, so when it comes to cyber reporting, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the EO, but I want to talk about the broader landscape as well. The executive order, it mostly focuses its attention on information sharing and about cyber reporting requirements for companies that do business with the federal government. And though that is an area of concern for us because a heck of a lot of companies fall into that bucket, it does specifically focus its attention on federal contracting. The thing is that the same things that we're talking about regarding the requirements around information sharing, the requirements around privacy, and the requirements around reporting are at the heart of broader bills that affect more companies. So the way that we have to figure out how to deal with these issues, and I've got lots of thoughts on the best way that we could potentially approach this, need to be talked about, even if we're talking about the companies not just affected by the EO. Warner, Rubio, and Collins have a popular bill that is moving in the Senate, focused on cyber reporting, and they're trying to figure out how they can approach it, and that's going to affect more than the people just in the EO. And right now, the EU is going through the process of updating their NIS directive. And the NIS2 directive focuses its attention on what requirements are going to be made on companies in the EU regarding cyber reporting. And actually, the issue of extraterritoriality isn't even a closed issue there. So there may be requirements of anybody who does business in the EU, whether they're an EU company or not, that are put on companies that are affected by the NIS directive. And what's really interesting there is that's pretty much all of us, because in the internet, we're all connected. And who doesn't do business with some entity in the EU? So I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to the continued conversation.
Well, thank you for getting us started on the executive order, and we will certainly talk more about that. But let's go ahead and broaden the conversation here. Joseph, I turned over to you to tell us a little bit about your perspectives on this topic of cybersecurity breaches and the executive order.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me. This is my first time doing this, and this is, I think, an awesome conversation, first and foremost. I start all of my talks, if you've ever seen me talk at the Atlantic Council, I always start my talks by saying, these are my opinions and my opinions alone, and these do not represent in any form or fashion my duties with the Department of Defense. Moving forward, I think that kind of when I look at the executive order itself, I really do believe that kind of the thought and the premise behind it is positive, right? It's that we want to become more transparent. We want to understand what our threats are and how do we attack those threats, or how do we defend against those threats. And I think that the federal government realizes that the private sector does this a lot more efficiently than we do. They move in a more effective and efficient fashion. And so they're quicker at understanding these threats and then being able to respond to those threats. Federal government is large and cumbersome and moves slow. And so we understand that. I think what they're trying to do is say, hey, why don't we open these lines of communication between these public-private partnerships in an industry so that we can learn what you guys are doing, and then you can also tell us what we should be doing. And if we can standardize that across all of those federal agencies, then we really are beginning to start to understand the threats and infiltrate those threats. I think the other premise behind that is, let's understand where so part of that is the supply chain. So there's 9 sections out. Hopefully everybody's already read it. But one part of that I think is very important, at least in my world and kind of what I'm privy to, is the supply chain logistics, right? So there, as an engineer, there's the hardware and there's the software. And you need to understand where both of those are coming from, because as you program something, if you've got something coming from a nefarious country, you may need to be concerned about any type of, scapegoats or little tidbits that they leave for a back door so that somebody can come in when these things are implemented into a federal system. I think that it's great that we want to get better transparency from our supply chain to understand where our chips are coming from and where the software is coming from. I think the labeling aspect is something that will be very important to everyone that kind of looks at that cares about cybersecurity and privacy and understanding those things. I do think that, so those are the good things. Those are kind of my high level. I'm smiling and I'm very happy about these things because these are the things that need to happen. The things that do concern me are more on the private sector, right? So the EO is saying, like, if you're doing business with the government, you need to have all of these things in line because you need to follow our cybersecurity mandate, which is really dictating to everyone because everyone wants to be part of the federal government because they have the money and you want to be able to pay for, you want to get a contract from the federal government. You begin to worry about how those things trickle down to everyday consumers and then the things that are happening in our lives. And so again, if you've ever seen something that I talk about here on the Atlantic Council and here as well, is privacy is a big concern of mine. Privacy policy is a big concern of mine. Understanding where my data is going, who's using my data, who's watching my internet searches, and who's watching what I've got going on is something that I definitely want to, I would want to delve into and try to understand, because, you know, we don't know what's a threat level and what's being monitored because it's a threat, you know, on an everyday stance. And so you're having a, you know, an ISP provider have to send that data to whomever, you don't know where it's going, you don't know who's monitoring it. I think that could be a concern for folks. I do think the overarching thought is how do we ensure that we're less of a blue team and are more of a red team, if you will, to understand, you know, all of these attacks that we've got is the premise, and trying to be open and transparent is what we want. That's the overall goal. And if they can keep that transparency, I think the sense making behind that will give trust and people will understand that, but it's gotta be fully transparent.
Let me ask you a quick question, if I could. You know, there's been a lot of attention in the last year because of both the SolarWinds hack that hit federal agencies, you know, the end of last year and maybe earlier, and then there's a lot of attention on the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. Could you just give it another minute or two on like the high level? What are these? Are these the same types of attack? Are they different attacks? What do we know about them, and how many of these do we have on a regular basis?
So the second part of that question, I wouldn't be able to tell you the exact number that we have, but what I do know, these attacks are different. And one of the things of the EO is to say, let's standardize a playbook, and we can use this playbook every single time. I don't know how well that's going to work. These folks that are developing these algorithms and this malware change it often, and it changes, it changes daily, right? And so you talk about this zero trust architecture where you don't trust anything because everything could have a point of attack to it. I think that's really the only way that you could go with a federal system, but I don't think that's the right way to go in a personal private system. Kind of to your point before, the infrastructure that we've got for these, for our railways and our oil and our energy, like these things are susceptible, right? So they're generally public traded companies, but they do operate within a federal space as well. And so how do we effectively manage that? We can't dictate what they're going to do, but we do need to make sure that they have the infrastructure and the systems that allow them to move freely. I don't want to take up all the time, but we'll continue to talk later. I definitely want to be able to give Pablo and Scott their time in the first 5 minutes as well.
Well, thank you, Joseph, and welcome, Pablo. Let's go ahead and get your perspective on these issues, and maybe you can kind of further elaborate on the extent of the SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline hacks, and what type of attacks were they, so to speak. So the floor is yours, Pablo.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And I'm going to take the opportunity to make the same disclaimer as my esteemed colleague Joseph, and say that my views are my own, and they do not reflect the views of my employer, either present or former. But overall, I think that the intent is good. I think they're trying to do the good thing. The problem is that we've had lots of good intentions and very little action. There's nothing in this executive order that I would argue with. What I would ask is, how are you going to enforce this? You've laid out these goals, but you've not laid out how they're going to be measurable, how you're going to hold people accountable. I think it is a very government-centric view, which is not surprising. We've had a couple of oopsies doing these kind of things in the past. Certainly when you're dealing with regulated industries, when you are asking them to report on things, what you cannot do is then hand over those reports to the regulators and then come back and beat those industries for things additional to an attack. So, when you're dealing with power and energy, or when you're dealing with finance, nobody's 100% compliant. That's just the reality of the business. There's always one thing that you just haven't gotten to or has broken. And so that leads to these incidents. And so now they've had the incident. When they share that threat information or those indications of compromise, you then can't go back to with the regulatory bodies and use the information they provided you to find them. That's just not going to work, and that is going to make industry very reluctant to cooperate. And that's why you see, despite the fact that we've got these federally mandated ISACs, you see industry groups setting up their own information sharing and analysis that they don't allow the government in. And so it's done more harm than good when we do those sort of things. When you look at the Colonial Pipeline and you look at the solar winds, I'm going to say something a little egregious, which is there was nothing advanced about any of those attacks. Both of those attacks could have been easily avoided by having sound basics in cybersecurity. In the case of solar winds, it was well publicized that the CEO kind of threw an intern under the bus. And my questions are, why is an intern working on a production system by themselves? Why wasn't there versioning control for the code? Why wasn't there a two-person check on changing the passwords for a public-facing server? So these are basic things that could have very much prevented the solar winds. Everything that happened after that about inserting code in backdoor was because those basic things that should have been in place were not in place. When it comes to Colonial Pipeline, again, it's the same thing. What few people are talking about is that the ransomware wasn't on the industrial control systems, right? There was no danger of an environmental disaster. It was on the billing system. And so this was strictly a business call that was made, and they were provided the shadow of cover of, well, you know, we're doing it for safety. It wasn't for safety. It was to protect profits. And again, you know, ransomware is one of those things that if you have a sound and worthwhile backup strategy, which includes restoring for backup on a regular basis to make sure that your backups are good and that you can do it when you need it, you get ransomware on your system, you wipe the systems, you're down for 6, 8, 10, 12 hours maybe, and you come back up with the last clean install, last clean backup, and you should have been fine at that point. And that just didn't happen. So I'm not sure that anything in here in this executive order would have addressed that. Sound cybersecurity principles would have done that. The supply chain, I think, is particularly interesting, and there's no doubt that we need an assured supply chain. There are lots of incidents that are not SolarWinds that show we need an assured supply chain. Like Joseph pointed out, there's a software and a hardware. We need to reinvigorate the chip manufacturing industry here in the United States so that we can have sound hardware on which we can run sound software. How do we do that? Well, as previously mentioned, the government has money. Lots of companies do want to get government contracts, but the Defense Federal and Acquisition Regulation is outdated. It's horrible. It absolutely precludes us being innovative. And it rewards bad performance. When you look at program managers within the Department of Defense, they get rewarded for seeing their contract to completion and spending all of the money. They get chastised and punished if they go, this is not delivering what we want, and killing the contract and saving taxpayer dollars. That has got to stop. There's a reason that innovative companies like Google and Apple do not want to work with the U.S. Department of Defense and with the federal government. And that's that our federal acquisition regulations are horrendous. No business can operate at a profit doing that and deliver a quality product. So I think we need to look internally first to fix that problem.
Let me just ask one quick follow-up for you, Pablo, before we go to Scott. Is ransomware a distinct category of cyber attack from what we traditionally think of as hacks, or should we just kind of lump it in with all the others? It's a breach. I mean, you kind of implied in your answer that ransomware is not a big deal if you are updating your sites and services on a hourly or daily basis. But I just want to get you to answer that question.
Yeah, so I would say that ransomware is malware like any other. It's just, you know, what does the payload do? Instead of providing access to the internal network so that the people can steal their intellectual property and data, it's a denial of service attack. It denies you access to your data. So the realities are that no matter how good your cybersecurity is, at some point you're going to have an incident. It's just going to happen. It's the nature of the beast. It's a mathematical certainty. So Part of having a sound cybersecurity program is how do you restore from incidents? And a very basic one going back before the internet is have good backups. Have good backups of data, make sure you can restore for backups. So honestly, there's always somebody that's going to be able to get a piece of malware in there, whether it's a backdoor, a keylogger, some other nefarious thing, ransomware. How do you restore from that is the same. If you can find the malware, you go in there, you kill the malware. In the case of ransomware, by the time you find it, it's probably going to have already encrypted some of your data. Great. How do you find out where the last clean copy of your data was and restore from that backup? I really don't understand why we make this more difficult.
Okay, wonderful. Let's now turn to Scott McCulloch, who's been involved in the communications and internet law space for 38 years and has deep knowledge of this topic. I'm very interested in what you have to say about the cybersecurity landscape, about the executive order, and other aspects, Scott. So over to you, and make sure to unmute yourself there, okay? Yeah, okay. There we go.
Hi, I too, this is the first time for me. Really happy to be a part of all of this. My name is Scott McCulloch. I'm a lawyer, not an engineer. So actually I became a lawyer because I didn't get into engineering school. And it's, I've been traumatized about that for many years. Nonetheless, my background is I do regulatory and administrative law. I focus on representing small companies, most of them startups. Hardly any of them are publicly traded. And typically what I do when I first speak to someone is I tell them there is this huge regulatory state out there, and we need to make sure that you're not doing anything that's going to get you caught into this regulatory system unless you make a conscious choice to enter that. I try to educate people about what the regulations are and how you can possibly comply with them. And so a lot of my practice is, one, keeping people out of regulation, and then two, once they are caught up in it, trying to help them work through what happens when you fall into the regulatory maw. I will tell you from all of my long experience, once you get dragged into the regulatory system, if you're small, you're not likely to survive very long. It is not friendly to small companies. It is almost consciously designed to protect the interests of the large incumbents. So when I look at the executive order, I'll start with that. I read it and I go, gosh, this is great. I've had information that's been stolen because the government has, I'm a veteran and I'm a disabled veteran, and some of that information was stolen. And I sure don't want bad actors to be able to penetrate the government's most important systems and get data and misuse it to the detriment of our people, and certainly not me. So I'm all for an executive order that's going to tighten up the security of government systems. And by necessity, that means you've got to deal with the acquisition rules. By the way, the other thing I tell my clients is don't ever try to sell to the federal government because it'll kill you. Okay, none of my clients ever really did. Once you do get caught up in that maw, yes, they very much can dictate your security practices, just as they're trying to do here. And it may not just show up in the executive order dealing with FAIR. It's going to show up over when the Federal Communications Commission gets a hold of you, or when the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission gets a hold of you, or as we will see shortly, when the Federal Trade Commission gets a hold of you. So I look at the executive order, and while I cannot understand a lot of it, and I know that a lot needs to be done and probably should be done, I'm trying to figure out how this is going to affect my small clients and whether they are going to be caught up in it, and if so, how they can survive it. So I looked at the thing, and it looked pretty good until I got to section 4. And once you get to section 4, subsections S, T, and U, it becomes plainly evident that this really isn't about just federal acquisitions. It is about developing regulations, or at least baseline standards, that are expected to apply to the industry generally, including those who sell only to consumers. They invoke FTC jurisdiction. They mention consumer products. And so it is plain to me that while this executive order cannot do it, it is laying the groundwork for the federal government to basically begin to regulate the entire tech sector. They will now be a fully regulated industry as a result of this. And as I said before, what that necessarily means is the only tech that there will be is going to be big tech. There will not be startups that start in a dorm or in a garage. Only the incumbents will be able to do what is necessary to comply with these regulations once they are finalized. Well, the executive order is good enough, but you have to look at the follow-on activities. NIST and the NTIA had jobs to do, and they have performed them in part. The NTIA has developed its definition of a standard bill of materials, and the NIST has developed a definition of critical software. It is evident from both of those documents that they are also intended to apply, if not immediately in the long term, to the private sector, even those who do not provide services or goods to the federal government. With broadband particularly, I would draw your attention to the NIST definition of critical software. If you are in the broadband business, you will have EO critical software as defined by the NIST. And that makes sense. You do have critical software, and you need to be concerned about the devices that attach to your networks, especially in the days of Internet of Things. Those devices out there are notoriously insecure. And while the industry needs to deal with it, I question the government's competence to do so. The government has not lately demonstrated that it's really competent to do very many things. And so I think the private sector needs to figure out a way to deal with it. Let me conclude. I think I've used my 5 minutes. My concern in all of this, while I certainly appreciate cybersecurity and I help people develop their own cybersecurity protocols all the time, my concern is that this is going to lead to the day where the only tech we have is big tech. And there are many today who think that big tech is the problem, not the solution. So that's my cautionary word. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. And let's actually kind of pull out the order, the executive order, the May 12th order. And as people have mentioned, there's nine substantive sections, and there's a definitions and a general provision, section 10 and 11. But Scott has identified section 4, which is enhancing the software supply chain security and the problems that he's identified there in, I guess you said, subsections S, T, and U. And again, this is detailed deep into the weeds. We won't go all the way down in there, but kind of my review of this showed that there's a bunch of other sections following this. Section 5, establishing a cyber safety review board. Section 6, standardizing the federal government's playbook for responses. 7, improving detection in federal networks. Section 8, improving federal government's investigation. So let's just talk about those kind of core sections because again, I mean, and love any context that any of you have, is what was driving this was this executive order kind of sitting, waiting to kind of, be issued. And then we had, Solar Winds and Colonial Pipeline, and boom, this was the reasoning. What's kind of driving this? And again, granted that it's not the whole picture, just while we speak for a moment about this executive order, what are some of your thoughts on those provisions about the review, the playbook, the detection and investigation of intrusions into federal government networks? And anyone who'd like to go. Joseph, go ahead and unmute yourself and address that.
I was muted. Sorry, guys. So I think this isn't the first time we tried to do this. I think we're at a critical junction. If you look at, I think, 97, Clinton tried to do a critical infrastructure, cybersecurity protection, and I think 2017, there was something very similar as well. Oh yeah, strengthening the cybersecurity of federal networks and critical infrastructure. I think both of those failed tremendously, in my opinion. I think they failed because there was a lack of transition. So what I mean by that is this: we are now transitioning to the cloud. Everything is going to the cloud. The federal government is trying to move to the cloud. And I think that because we don't have a data protection system anymore where you can't just plug in your USB or you don't have an encrypted USB, they're now saying, hey, this is going to be a problem. All of our data is going to be gone. Like we're going to get hacked. The data from the federal government will be somewhere. And so it's kind of this impetus, this almost, lighting the fire that we've got to figure out a way to build compliance and then to also understand how we can protect ourselves. So all of, if you read the executive order, it's got 10 different people reporting to each other before they say, shall do this. So it's 7 different agencies talking to each other in order to produce one document. I think that's too many. I think that's convoluted personally, but I understand it. You want to have everybody's hands kind of in it because we got to understand what this migration to the cloud means, right? And the migration to the cloud is happening. It's already happening. It's nothing we can stop. That is private industry. And so it does, inherently say we've got to, to Scott's point, I agree with Scott, actually. I don't like that it's inherently saying that we've got to put these rules on private industry. But in the same token, if the federal government is trying to modernize, they've got to, maybe they have to section it off. And there's a difference between federal and private industry. I'm not the person to be able to say that or the one that has the money for that, but I do understand that they've got to have some type of policy that allows the federal government to have something that has data protection for all of their data, as well as this modernization of things. So you look at the VA, they're trying to modernize. You look at anything within the DoD, they're all trying to modernize. And as they move to the cloud, how do we ensure that these things are protected and there's compliance? And so they look at all of the failures of other agencies and say, well, why don't we all get together and figure out if we can standardize this as we move forward?
Let's keep moving. Let's hear from Pablo and then from Christian on this question. So go ahead, Pablo.
I'm going to do something I never thought I would do, which is I'm going to argue for more government regulation. I'm going to disagree. I'm going to disagree with Scott. I'm going to disagree with Scott because since the early 90s, the internet industry has had every opportunity to fix these basic problems, and it's not in their interest to do so. And so they have not done it. And they will not do it unless forced by regulation. I don't think that this is going to stifle innovation. That is always the cry of industry when there's talk of regulations, like, oh, you're going to kill innovation. That's how we ended up with a disinformation catastrophe with Facebook and Twitter, because there was no regulation and we haven't done it. That is why we've got code running on implantable medical devices with no assurance of the proficiency of the person that coded it, which is why Philips had to recall pacemakers. We're getting to the point where IoT and computers and bits and byte of flesh and bone. I can't imagine buying a car without having internet highway transportation safety crash test rating. I expect that same level of assurance when I buy something that is going to go in a minivan that's driving my kids around, or an implantable medical device that my father is going to have, or in an HVAC system or OT system that runs, the electrical power grid in Texas.
Well, I'm going to let Christian go first, but my question I will ask now, so you can think about, is how can you be so certain that the further government regulation will actually improve the cybersecurity issue that you've just raised? But I want to hear Christian first, and then we'll come back to Pablo or others.
That's a really interesting question, Drew. I will say that I don't think it is necessarily the right right question to either agree or disagree about the approach to whether we should approach legislation. It is happening. This EO, though, doesn't focus on, Pablo, the things that would prevent those attacks that happened. It mostly focuses on communications and reporting requirements, not things that, as you said, would have directly changed anything in the event, in the circumstances specifically regarding what happened with SolarWinds or Colonial Pipeline. I think that it's clear because basically when Colonial Pipeline came online, this EO got issued right after, that the 8,000 plus words that were interagency developed were not done in direct response to this, but that was a timely release date that they could choose to get a little extra publication, a little extra boost for the news stories about the acts that they were doing to try and focus on reporting requirements. I think that a lot of the things that are coming out of this are indeed, as Joseph was saying, these interagency documents and these collaborative documents that will lead towards other things. One of the challenges that we have as an industry association is to make sure that those aren't done in a vacuum, because there are ways that are going to crush innovation that can go about this, that we can use to go about the regulations that are certainly coming, whether we think they are good or bad. And there are ways that could be lighter touch approaches that could potentially lead to a better, a safer environment that doesn't make it so that only incumbents can do the work of internet infrastructure providers, which is obviously the outcome that we would prefer. And I've been thinking a lot about what, I don't want to say good regulation, but what a regulatory path would look like that would accomplish that in an environment as complex as the internet's infrastructure, which is impossible to have a one-size-fits-all method on. And Scott had mentioned NIST.
Which stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, a division of the Commerce Department, and does a lot of kind of standardized measurements and other things. So please go ahead,
yes,
Christian.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. I've been thinking that an approach that could be effective to try and figure out cyber reporting requirements and perhaps even addressing cyber hygiene principles that could work would be something akin to the process that was undertaken in order to build the NIST cybersecurity framework, or the CSF, which was done in collaboration with industry, is technology neutral, and is voluntary. So I'm trying to keep an open mind as we go ahead and talk with interagency groups who are working on these documents now to try and find paths that don't just say, don't regulate the internet, it's magical and we don't want to mess with it, but still create an environment where at the end of the day, we're going to end up in an environment that continues to be pro-innovation.
Pablo, let's hear from you, your reaction to that and to my earlier question.
Yeah, so I'm looking specifically at section 4, paragraph S. And the part of that really gets me excited is the part that says, Director of NIST deems appropriate shall initiate pilot programs informed by existing consumer product labeling programs to educate the public on security capabilities of Internet of Things. So I've got this dream. That, when you watch mothers go shop in the grocery store, right, there's an entire aisle dedicated to peanut butter. And the way that they choose is they turn the jar of peanut butter around and they read the label on the back that's got the nutritional ingredients information. I would like to see that same kind of labeling on Internet of Things, so that when Americans go to Best Buy or wherever they buy their electronics and they're looking for security cameras, or they're looking for smart devices, or they're looking for their next home router, they can turn on the back and see what the ingredients are and what the security features are. And we've had something like this in the past. It was called Common Criteria. And it ended up, a lot of the companies in industry complained about it. We had Common Criteria, and then what they decided was, hey, this is a great marketing campaign because we can get NSA to rate us as a B+, while all of our competitors are a B. In the same way that when they advertise cars, they advertise their crash test safety ratings. And the reason that program no longer exists, in part, is because it got abused a little bit by industry, and NSA just couldn't keep up with the demand. But the Commerce Department certainly could stand up a product or this sort of program and allow people to, companies, to get their products rated, and that's a competitive advantage.
Okay. So since this was particularly a section 4S, the one you've just read here about the labeling products to educate the public on the security capabilities of IoT, and that was something Scott specifically mentioned as problematic. I want to give Scott a chance to chime in. Why is this labeling a bad idea?
Well, let me first admit to a bit of personal conflict. if this all comes about, then I will be busy. I will be engaged full-time by a whole bunch of people helping them draft their disclosure labels. We will try to figure out how to put it on our product or our packaging and use all of the words, what font size is required, all of these things. It's going to employ a bunch of lawyers to do a whole bunch of work that I'm not sure will actually inform consumers who probably won't understand what most of the words mean. Now, am I for disclosure? Yes, I am. Am I for improving the government system cybersecurity? Yes, I am. Am I interested in a regulatory regime that is going to roll up all the ladders for small businesses and startups and protect only the big guys who can afford to do this and leave big tech as a completely regulated industry with only big companies? No, I'm not for that. And that's what I see from this provision and the one that follows and the one that follows.
Yeah, well, we've had this kind of parallel debate around privacy regulations, right? And for years, almost decades, there's been a push for a big kind of privacy legislation, whereas America has taken a more piecemeal approach, financial privacy, health information privacy, and whereas the EU is kind of driving this debate, right, around privacy. And I mean, again, you actually, I remember hearing stuff, I'm not sure if people are still talking about labeling on privacy standards. I'm just kind of like, we haven't really talked about privacy per se in this discussion. How does the privacy issue interface with the security? And Christian, a little bit earlier, you mentioned, you know, that there's the Warner-Rubio bill that's out there too, that might do more to the private players, whereas this is just dealing with government and government contractors. Christian, and actually Joseph, let's get you back in this discussion. What are some of your thoughts about, you know, A, this privacy question, but B, what does the industry have to fear or not fear going forward as Congress kind of comes back to security and privacy that will apply to non-government players per se?
Did you want me to start?
Start with Christian, yeah.
I'll just say that it gets really complicated really quickly, which is not surprising. And yes, Europe with their GDPR regulation was a forerunner in how globally we should be thinking about privacy, and many people have, many companies have set their privacy requirements around GDPR requirements around personal identifiable data, which obviously needs to be protected when it comes to cybersecurity. Now with the NIS2 directive, they're talking about KYBC, or know your business customer requirements, which may differentiate the difference between what we refer to as legal persons versus natural persons, which obviously the GDPR does, what basically mean the company data versus individual data, and require some publishing of company data to make sure that there is transparency there. So all of a sudden, companies have requirements to ensure that they are keeping some data really private and publishing other data, and possibly have multiple systems to do that. And all of a sudden, through government regulation, you end up in a situation where your privacy requirements end up being very complicated very quickly. That is the landscape by which we are entering into an environment where we need to be very protective of some data, possibly disclose other data. And like Scott said, there are serious concerns about how do we build this complicated system and get small companies to be able to comply with it.
In a very quick nutshell, what is the Warner-Rubio bill do beyond what we've been talking about with the executive order?
There's an extent to which I think similar frameworks are in place, but you're talking about extending to the full stack rather than just focusing on government contracting.
Yeah, we're having this debate between the pro-regulation and the critics of regulation. Joseph, help us navigate. What's your perspective on this dispute here?
So I think Christian brought up a very great point. We have to remember that industry wants your data. They want your data because they want to be able to produce a predictive algorithm to see what you're going to buy so that you can continue to make money. The government doesn't need your money, but they are supposed to be for the people, right? And so you're at odds at the end of the day. These two folks are at odds. And so I had just put in the chat one of the things that I find interesting and that can possibly have a voice in this kind of battle, this dichotomy, would be the Safety Review Board, which is in Section 5, right? So the cybersecurity section.
Tell us what that is, Joseph. What is the Cyber Safety Review Board?
Sure. So this is as part of the executive order. There is a board that is going to be developed that has both industry and the federal government. So a lot of the heads of the federal government coming together to determine, what's important. How do we improve cybersecurity? What data is permissible to be passed between the two? What data should we be looking at? What data shouldn't we be looking at? And really having an overall kind of overarching effect. As we all know that federal government makes boards for everything. Companies do the same thing, but they make boards for everything. And sometimes they don't really have that effect. It seems to be based on this section that you're going to have some pretty big wigs that are coming in from the federal government, and they're expecting to have big wigs come in from industry to be able to help drive that conversation and have that conversation of maybe what is our privacy versus our need for privacy versus our need for cybersecurity, right? So there's a difference when you're working at different federal agencies, what that juxtaposition is. And so I'm going to be very interested to see who they pick for this. I think that it's going to be something that will help determine the outcome of the cybersecurity. I do like the executive order puts timelines on everything, right? So this needs to be done within 30 days. This needs to be done within 180 days. So we're actually holding folks accountable, holding the federal government accountable, but also holding the industry accountable for things that they need to do so that we can start to move this into a more transparent and more effective cybersecurity regime for the federal government.
Now, we also have another debate going on here in the chat. Let's bring it out to all of our listeners. And by the way, this is now live on Broadband Breakfast, as well as all of our other channels, which it always has been. So it's viewable that way. But Christian, they can't see the chat stream, which is why I mentioned it. Christian and Pablo, you've been discussing, I guess, the SBOM, again, acronym watch. Christian, tell us what the SBOM is and what was it, good or bad? And let's hear Pablo's response about the Cyber UL program by Mudge Zadko. So go ahead, Christian.
All I was doing was I was trying to riff on the Pablo had mentioned his peanut butter vision about a future that
labeling, security labeling, right?
Security labeling, right? And I had talked about, I would reference that when Scott had his opening statement, he had mentioned that NTIA has been working on a program called Sbomb, which is the Software Bill of Materials.
Software Bill of Materials. Okay, rolls off the tongue.
Bill of Materials. The idea being kind of like you have a label on your peanut butter that says there's, peanut butter, oil, whatever else on it, that a software would have similar thing. There'd be requirements, labeling requirements on software. And, the reason that they have an interest in doing that sort of thing is that they don't want to get into a situation where, software is built, particularly in an open source environment, which is a good environment to build software in. You have programs that are built iteratively over a number of years on different libraries. Some libraries end up not supported. And understanding that you're in an environment in which you have an unsupported library, a piece of software that has an unsupported library is something that they're saying people should know, for instance, for cybersecurity reasons. There are lots of there are lots of takes on Sbomb. And I'm going to cop out and say that I2 Coalition itself does not have a position on Sbomb. I can tell you about it, but I don't have a position on it.
Okay, you've gotten it. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, this is Joe. I think Sbomb. I think it's in. Although the EO doesn't say this, I think it's going to have to be agency specific, right? Because if you look at, for instance, the Department of Defense, we have to know these things. We have to know where all of these things are coming from. It's a non-starter at this point. In a sense. And
when you say what these things are coming from, what you mean?
I mean the software coding, the entire supply chain for any coding that's going into a DoD system or going into a federal system itself.
Well, that's a great point. And Christian, again, no one take us on a huge tangent when we only have 5 or 6 minutes remaining, but could you just speak to the open source component? And a lot of people kind of don't necessarily get this. Open source is more secure, or can be more secure than closed proprietary software. And why is that, Christian? And how does this kind of relate to this? That's
an area where there's lots of debate. But for those people that aren't involved in this, the difference, I think, is the analogy that I've used in the past is it is a car with its hood welded shut versus a car where you can open it up and you can tinker with the insides. In an open source environment, you are seeing what the software is made, components that are made make up the software individually, and can potentially be in an environment where you can play with them and build on them iteratively. And in a closed software environment, it really is only the people that produce the software that can work on it.
Okay. Now, there's also this question about the Cybersecurity Review Board and whether it's public. And forgive me, Joseph, if you just covered this completely, but can you address what is the Cybersecurity Review Board? Is there currently a Cybersecurity Review Board? Granted that there's a new one called for in this executive order.
To my knowledge, no. I could be wrong, and please, if someone does know of one, please correct me. But to my knowledge, there is not one at this particular moment. I do not know, it doesn't explicitly say that there will be open to the public. I do know that there will be open to comments from the outcomes of the board itself. And so, the everyday citizen can provide their comments to their recommendations. That doesn't mean that it's not. I just don't see it directly put in there. So I would want to say that just to kind of as a caveat.
All right, let's actually go to some closing thoughts by each of you. We'll actually do it in reverse order. So we'll go Scott, Pablo, Joseph, and Christian. So kind of takeaways from our discussion here in regard to the executive order, but also the broader landscape we're seeing right now, and how players, broadband industry players, and edge providers need to be thinking about these questions. So Scott, any final thoughts for us?
Well, I think the sad news for anybody in this is they're just going to have to hire another lawyer and another couple of engineers so that they can try to work through what all this means and try to make it fit to whatever their widget is. It is plain to me that there's going to be yet another layer of regulation on the tech industry, another burden, another barrier to entry to small startups. Some of it is necessary. I will certainly grant that, especially when it comes to essential products and services used by the federal government, including and especially the Department of Defense. I agree completely that DOD needs to be able to look in the black box. I agree with that completely. And so maybe just as a policy matter, those of us who believe in competition and eliminating barriers to entry are just going to have to accept that these days, small companies will not be able to compete for federal government business. My only hope is that as an outgrowth of all of this, we do not also close the general economy to small startups and end up with the only tech being big tech everywhere.
Okay, great. Pablo, closing thoughts that you have on this topic.
I think there are good intentions here, but as we all know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I know they've got deadlines. There's no consequences. I don't think this is going to move the needle at all.
The executive order, that is not going to move the needle. The
executive order, it's not going to move the needle at all. I think we're going to, wait till the next administration, and there'll be another effort that also won't go anywhere until we can put real and substantial penalties to do this. I think now's the time for industry to include small business to stop fighting regulation and maybe work with government to figure out how we can get good regulation. Congress has not had an Office of Technical Assistance to advise them on technical issues for a long time. And the door has been closed by industry, who doesn't want to work with government on any regulation. There's got to be something in the middle. Otherwise, we're just going to get bad regulation.
Right. Well, interesting perspective. You've been the contrarian for us here today, Pablo. Okay, Joe, let's hear your perspectives on this.
I think I'll take the optimist view of this. I think that the executive order is asking for transparency in cybersecurity for the federal government. I think that is something that's needed. We need to build trust. We need to trust our government. We need to trust our suppliers. That's not that may be an optimist. We're not a fool. I said, be an optimist, not a fool. I think Scott is dead on. I think if you make that barrier too high, the small startups are not going to have enough money to build their systems to be able to do the things with the federal government. I think we need to be aware of that, and we need to kind of take note of like the checks and balances, right? So we're doing a SWOT analysis on these things, and we really need to understand who's it hurting in the end, and to remember that at the end of the day, the order is trying to call for the ability for the federal government to standardize their responses, as well as to understand how we're no longer only a blue team. We're only by blue team, I mean, we're only responding to attacks. We need to understand how to also attack, in my opinion.
We need the red, white, and blue team, right?
Absolutely.
Joseph? All right. Christian, final thoughts, batting cleanup here.
Thanks. Real quickly, the worst case scenario is what Scott described, where only the incumbents, only large organizations, only large tech will exist in the tech environment. We know that regulation is coming. We know that the EO is just a piece of a bigger puzzle. That we know that there's legislation pending that does similar things. We know that Europe is talking about similar things, and ultimately regulation in some form is coming. Knowing that it is coming, we can try to create the best possible environments where we get the best outcomes while preserving innovation. That's why we need to be part of the ongoing conversation, and why groups like mine exist, so that we can continue to talk to the administration, continue to talk to Europe, continue to talk to people on the Hill, to try and get them to understand the levers of innovation, so that they don't do stupid stuff that messes it up.
All right. Well, with that, and before I thank all of our guests, I just want to remind you that we are here every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. Next Wednesday, September 1st, we'll be looking at what's next for broadband infrastructure legislation. And the week after, September 8th, we will be in person and live online. So if you can't be there in Washington, we will miss you, but we will still have a chance to see you in this virtual format. But do register to attend so you can be at our broadband breakfast for lunch. And don't forget the Broadband Community Summit that's coming up. We'll be talking more about that over the next 4 weeks in the lead up to the event in Houston and online, September 27th through September 30th. On behalf of Christian Dawson, Joseph Bonneville, Pablo Brewer, and Scott McCulloch, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next Wednesday at 12 noon.